The two graves behind me in remote Box Elder County, those of Anna and Marie Kalpikov, are all that remains of a beautiful Russian spiritualist community established in this part of the world back in 1914. Now, they are the final nail in the coffin in a little settlement that was doomed from the start. And that's because these people, who were very well-meaning pacifists, were sold many acres of land for top dollar. They spent all of their life savings on it, being promised that it was a beautiful, lush land with soil that awaited the settler's plow. Now, this is a salt desert, and even farmers out here find it very difficult to use. So they came out here in early 1914 and quickly realized what trouble they were in, but they tried their hardest to make a settlement. They built a school, they built homes, they associated with neighbors just up the way who had a small community out there called Park Valley, and in 1914, in March, they are pacifists. So Andrew Kalpikov, he's playing with a .22 rifle, and this drew the ire of his wife, Anna. And Andrew was also considered a sort of spiritual leader in the community. They didn't have official spiritual leaders, but Andrew was a very well-respected man. And as the wife is saying, you know, it's kind of dangerous to be playing with a rifle, and aren't we kind of against weaponry? He says, this is just to hunt food, and it's not even loaded. Look. And he goes to show her the rifle, and it goes off and strikes her in the chest, killing her almost instantly. Now, Andrew's brothers and friends had to restrain him because he was trying to rush the gun to take his own life. And just as he kind of makes peace with what he's done, their daughter, Marie, she also dies of just a sickness, as children back in the 1910s often did. And they're buried here. And this marks the end of Russian settlement. But I want to talk a little bit about their brand of spiritual Christianity, because it goes back, a lot of people say, to the 11th century AD, a fascinating type of spiritual practice that is found only in the Far East and eventually as exiles on the West Coast in California. Now, the story of why these spiritual Christians were called Molochans, or milk drinkers, begins all the way back in 11th century Turkey. The Eastern Church was trying to get established amongst Turkic people, but they said, we understand you subsist almost entirely off of meat and dairy, and because we have over 200 fasting days a year, we'll allow you to drink milk. Now, this was a practice that occurred nowhere else in Eastern Europe, and the Turkic people were kind of united by this unique practice. The Tatars did it, and the Turkic tribes throughout Europe did it, and it distinguished them from other Christians. So as the centuries go on, there's a group of ethnic people in Crimea calling themselves the Karaites, and they were also milk drinkers during the fasting days. Well, they believed in something called Judaizing, so they adopted the Old Testament, and particularly Leviticus, as rules that they should follow. Now, to suggest this in the 15th and 16th centuries meant certain death, and the leader of the Judaizers, he was killed in a monastery on the breaking wheel. They broke every bone in his body before killing him. So they got a sort of unique leadership and guidance, and they were already breaking off from mainstream Orthodox Christianity at this point. And by the 1680s, they were a part of what you would call the Duke Boers, a spiritual Christian group. But around this time, they started disagreeing with the leadership of the Duke Boers. They said, we don't like that you have these head leaders of your villages. We think that every man should be a temple and lead himself, and we also believe in more relaxed spiritual guidelines. So they broke off. The son-in-law of the leader of the Duke Boers broke off into what he called spiritual Christianity, and what the Duke Boers called milk drinkers, or Molochans. And they adopted a pacifist message and a message of leaderless guidance for their community, and they also considered themselves not so much mystics, because there was a huge push at the time for mysticism, particularly amongst a group called the Cleists, or the Christs, which would practice these incredibly bizarre rituals and mass group orgies and self-mutilation in the name of Christ. They would just say, you know, the Molochans, we spiritual Christians, we are a common sense, logical, peaceful group of pacifists, very similar to Mennonites, I've said. And so they were tolerated by Catherine the Great, but during a time of war, they refused to fight. So they were kind of exiled out of the center of Russia to places like Armenia, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, and Siberia. And by the very early 1900s, a lot of them migrated over to America, and about 1,000 of them got established in California. And it was from there that the 20 or so people came out here in 1914 to establish Russian settlement.